What would you do if you were snowed in with something, or someone you didn't invite? Well, that's exactly what happened to me and my wife, Rachel, when we rented a remote cabin to escape the city. We thought we were just looking for some peace and quiet. Instead, we found ourselves trapped in a nightmare. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a small, secluded cabin deep in the mountains, far away from the noise and stress of city life. We arrived on a crisp winter morning, and the place was everything we'd hoped for. The snow was pristine, the air fresh, and there was something comforting about the isolation. The kind of peacefulness you only find when the world outside is covered in a thick blanket of snow. We figured we'd spend a few days unplugged, just enjoying each other's company. But that's not how things went. On the third day, the storm hit. At first, it was just a few flurries. Nothing to worry about. We sat by the fire, enjoying the crackling warmth, and I figured it'd be over by morning. But it wasn't. The wind picked up, and by nightfall, the storm was raging. The snow swirled so heavily that we couldn't even see the driveway anymore, and the temperature dropped so low that it felt like the walls of the cabin were closing in on us. By the next day, we were completely snowed in. No way to leave, no way to get in touch with anyone. Just us, the storm, and the silence that started to feel oppressive. But that wasn't the worst part. The first knock came around midnight. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it. A faint tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch swaying in the storm. But when I looked out, I saw nothing. Nothing but snow. No footprints, no sign of life. Just endless white outside. I didn't think much of it and went back to sleep, but the sound, it stuck with me. It came again, louder this time. And it wasn't coming from just one window. It was moving, tapping on different panes, as though something or someone was walking around the cabin. I woke Rachel up, and we both checked the windows. There was nothing there, just the storm and the snow piled high outside. I told Rachel it was nothing. Maybe it was the storm causing the weird noises. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The knocking didn't stop. Every night it got worse, moving from window to window. It was like something or someone was circling the cabin, trying to get in. I started staying up late, listening for it. And then one night, I saw something I'll never forget. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. But this time, it was more than just knocking. It was the door handle rattling. Not from the wind, not like it had been before. This was deliberate. Slow, as if someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the flashlight, and Rachel was right behind me. We crept to the door, holding our breath, and I tried to peer through the cracks in the wood. I didn't see anything, just the swirling snow. But then I saw something on the walls. Scratches. Deep gouges in the wood near the windows, as if something, or someone, had tried to carve its way in. The marks were rough, jagged, and unlike anything I'd seen before. I froze. Rachel froze. I swear I didn't do that. I know Rachel didn't. We had been inside all day, and there were no signs of anything moving around out there. But there they were, these deep, violent scratches like claw marks. And the longer I stared at them, the more they seemed to pulse with something almost alive. I don't know how else to explain it. It was like the cabin itself was warning us, but I didn't want to believe it. Not yet. That night, the knocking came again. But this time it was louder, more frantic. Then, we heard something even worse. Footsteps. Not from outside, not from the storm, but from inside the cabin, walking around the hallways, pacing. I grabbed the kitchen knife, and Rachel was holding the flashlight, but neither of us knew what we were going to do if we actually saw something. Then, in the doorway of our bedroom, I saw it. A figure. Tall. Thin. Almost skeletal. It was standing there, just watching us. It was completely still, like it was waiting for us to notice. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Vanished. No sound, no trace. Just nothing. Rachel screamed, and I didn't think. I grabbed her hand, and we bolted for the door. We didn't care about the cold, the storm, or the snow. We just had to get out. We ran through the snow, barely able to see, barely able to breathe, until we finally found a ranger station at dawn. We were shaking, half frozen, and our minds were barely able to comprehend what had just happened. When we went back to the cabin with the rangers, there was nothing. No scratches on the walls. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. It was like nothing had ever happened. But we knew. We knew what we had seen. And to this day, I can't stop wondering, how did anyone get to the cabin during that storm? And more importantly, was it even human? It was supposed to be an adventure, a challenge. I had been hiking for years, always preferring solitude, the quiet of nature, and the peace that came with it. But when I decided to hike through a remote, snow-covered trail in the mountains, something about it felt different. The weather forecast had warned of a storm rolling in, but I didn't think much of it. It was just another hike, another trail, another adventure. What could go wrong? I began the hike early in the morning, my boots crunching in the snow with each step. The cold air bit at my skin, but the beauty of the untouched landscape made everything seem worth it. The path was narrow, winding through dense pines and steep inclines. I had been on trails like this before, and I had always felt a sense of control. But this time, something was off. The deeper I went, the more the snow began to fall, and soon, the trail became difficult to follow. Still, I pressed on, determined to finish the hike before the storm got worse. Hours passed, and the sky grew darker as the storm began to pick up. By the time I reached the clearing, the wind was howling, and the snow was coming down so thick that I could barely see 5 feet in front of me. That's when I first noticed it, a set of footprints in the snow, fresh and deep, trailing behind me. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe someone else had taken the same path, or maybe I had missed their tracks earlier. But as I walked forward, I realized something didn't add up. The tracks were too close to mine, too perfectly aligned, as if whoever was following me had been moving at the exact same pace, matching my every step. My heart started to race, and I turned around, scanning the snow behind me. But there was nothing. No one. No sign of anyone following me. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The storm, the cold, it was making me paranoid. But then the footprints abruptly stopped, right in the middle of the open clearing. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The tracks just stopped. No sign of a struggle. No sign of anyone turning around or leaving the area. Just nothing. The snow was untouched beyond that point, smooth and undisturbed. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt the sudden, overwhelming urge to turn back. But I had come too far. I wasn't going to let my fear control me. I kept moving forward, but the unease lingered in my chest, gnawing at me. As I made my way to a small patch of trees, I set up camp and pitched my tent quickly, knowing the storm was only going to get worse. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. I had everything I needed, my gear, my food, my warmth, and the storm was just nature doing its thing. But as I sat in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind howled outside, but I could hear something else, something faint. Footsteps. Soft at first, then louder, crunching in the snow, getting closer to my tent. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear. The footsteps circled around the tent, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was taking its time. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the door of the tent, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no movement. Just the storm, blowing harder now, and the quiet of the night surrounding me. I waited, and waited. The footsteps didn't stop. They continued circling, getting closer, then farther away, as if the thing was playing with me. I stayed perfectly still, praying that whatever it was would go away, but the footsteps kept coming back. It was almost like it knew I was in there, almost like it was trying to make me panic. When I finally got the courage to peek outside, flashlight in hand, I saw it. At first, it was just a silhouette, a humanoid figure standing in the distance, just on the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and I could barely make out its features in the snowstorm. But what I could see made my stomach twist in knots. It wasn't human. It didn't move like a person. It swayed in place, almost like it was waiting for something. I watched it for what felt like an eternity, my breath caught in my throat. And then, in an instant, it was gone. Vanished into the storm, as if the wind had swallowed it whole. I don't know how long I stayed in that tent, too terrified to move, but when I finally packed up and left the next morning, I was shaken. I thought I had imagined the whole thing. I was exhausted, my mind playing tricks on me after hours in the cold and dark. But it didn't stop there. When I got back to my car and started unloading my gear, I found something that made my blood run cold. Strange scratches on the side of my backpack, like something had tried to get inside. Long, jagged marks, deep enough to tear through the fabric. I couldn't explain it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been following me wasn't finished yet. I later spoke with experts about the area. They told me no animals could have been in that part of the mountain during the storm. Too dangerous. No tracks, no evidence, and no explanation for what I had experienced. So I'll ask you again, what was out there? Imagine walking into a snow-covered village, only to find that everyone has disappeared overnight. That's exactly what happened to me and my friends during a road trip we'll never forget, or escape from. It was supposed to be a fun getaway. 4 of us, me, Ryan, Sarah, and Emily, had planned a winter road trip to explore some scenic routes and get a break from the daily grind. The snowstorm wasn't in the forecast when we started driving, but by the time it hit, we were already too far from any major highway to turn back. The flakes came down thick, the wind howled through the trees, and soon, we couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. "We need to find somewhere to stop," Ryan said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His knuckles were white, and I could see the tension in his jaw. None of us disagreed. Driving in those conditions was suicidal. The GPS had stopped working hours ago, and our phones had no signal. We were relying on a paper map, but even that wasn't helping much. The road twisted and turned through dense forest, the snow piling up faster than the wipers could clear it. Just when we were about to give up and pull over, Emily spotted something through the storm. "Look," she shouted, pointing ahead. Through the haze of snow, faint lights flickered in the distance. A village. Relief washed over all of us. Shelter, warmth, safety. As we drove closer, the village came into view. It was small, maybe a dozen houses clustered together, their roofs heavy with snow. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, and warm light glowed from the windows. It looked like something out of a postcard, untouched by time. But as we parked the car and stepped into the snow, a strange feeling settled over me, an unease I couldn't explain. The air was too still, too quiet. "Hello," Ryan called out, his voice echoing off the surrounding trees. No answer. We walked through the village, looking for signs of life, but there was no one. No children playing, no people shoveling snow, no footsteps in the drifts. It was as if the entire village had just vanished. The houses, though, were intact. Inside the first house we checked, the table was set for dinner. Plates of food sat untouched, frozen solid from the cold. A fire smoldered in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. It looked as if the family had been sitting down to eat when they suddenly stood up and walked out, never coming back. The other houses were the same. Beds were unmade, mugs of tea sat half-drunk on counters, and coats hung by the doors, waiting for someone to put them on. Everything was in its place, except for the people. "This is weird," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, clutching her coat tightly around her. None of us wanted to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. This wasn't normal. Then we saw the symbols. They were carved into the snow, circling each house, strange and intricate. At first glance, they looked like random patterns, but the longer I stared, the more they seemed deliberate, like they meant something. They weren't words, but they had an unnatural symmetry that made my stomach churn. Who had made them? And why? "We need to leave," Emily said suddenly. Her voice trembled, and her eyes darted around the empty village. I wanted to agree with her, but there was something about the storm. It was getting worse. The wind had picked up, and the snow was falling so heavily that the path we'd walked in on was already gone. We were trapped, at least for the night. Reluctantly, we decided to stay in one of the houses until the storm passed. We chose the largest one, huddling together in the living room with a fire crackling in the hearth. But none of us could sleep. Every creak of the old house, every howl of the wind made us jump. And then late into the night, we heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was the sound of the house settling, or maybe the wind blowing through the trees. But the rhythm was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow just outside the house. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and motioned for us to stay put while he checked it out. I wanted to stop him, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to move. He opened the door and shone the light into the storm. "I don't see anything," he said, but his voice was shaky. Then, just as he turned to come back inside, we all saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the village, barely visible through the snow. It was tall and thin, with a distorted silhouette that didn't quite look human. It didn't move. It just stood there watching us. Ryan slammed the door shut, bolting it behind him. "We're leaving," he said, his face pale. But leaving wasn't easy. The storm had obliterated the road, and the snow was so deep that we could barely make progress. Worse, we weren't alone. As we trudged through the drifts, I kept seeing movement in the corner of my eye, figures darting between the trees, just beyond the reach of our flashlights. Every time I turned to look, they disappeared. The air felt heavy, like the storm itself was pushing against us, trying to force us back to the village. We didn't stop until we reached the car. By some miracle, it started, and we sped down the road, not caring that we couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. We just wanted to get away. The figures never followed us onto the road, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me until we reached the next town. When we told the locals what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. "There's no village out there," one of them said. "Never has been. We tried to find it again, even checked maps and satellite images. But they were right. The village wasn't there. It never was. So if you ever find yourself lost in a snowstorm, and you see lights in the distance, think twice before heading toward them. Because some places aren't meant to be found." They say still waters run deep, but in winter, the ice can hide unspeakable horrors. I learned this the hard way one night on a frozen lake, where I came closer to something unimaginable than I ever want to admit. I'd heard about the lake from some friends, a perfect spot for skating, hidden deep in the woods. "It's quiet out there," they said. "Peaceful. The kind of place where you can skate for hours without being bothered." What they didn't mention, or maybe they didn't know, was the lake's reputation. That it wasn't just quiet out there. It was too quiet. And the locals? They avoided it like the plague. It was a cold, clear night when I decided to go. The kind of night where the stars seemed sharper, and the moonlight lit up the snow like silver. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just grabbed my skates, bundled up, and headed out. Something about the idea of gliding across the ice under the stars sounded perfect. Magical, even. I had no idea what I was walking into. The trail to the lake was easy enough to follow. The snow muffled my footsteps, and the trees loomed tall and dark on either side of me. The air felt heavier as I got closer, though thicker somehow. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the cold settling in. When I finally reached the lake, it was beautiful. Pristine. The ice was smooth, untouched, and stretched out endlessly under the moonlight. I could see my breath fogging up the air as I laced up my skates, the sound of the laces snapping against the leather the only noise around me. But as I stepped onto the ice, that's when the unease began. At first, it was subtle, a faint hum in the back of my mind. Something about the silence didn't feel right. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive. I pushed the thought away and started skating, the crisp air stinging my cheeks as I picked up speed. For a while, it was everything I'd hoped for. The glide of the skates, the rush of the cold air, the moonlight dancing off the surface of the ice. But then, I heard it. Whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind. It had to be, right? But the longer I skated, the clearer the sound became. Soft, murmuring voices, rising and falling like waves. I stopped in the middle of the lake, listening, but the whispers stopped too. The only sound was my breathing, sharp and shallow, echoing in the night. I told myself I was imagining things, that the cold and the isolation were messing with my head. But deep down, I knew better. When I started skating again, I felt it, a presence, like something was watching me. I glanced around, but the lake was empty. Just me, the ice, and the endless forest surrounding it. That's when I saw the shadows. They moved under the ice, darting back and forth beneath my feet. At first, I thought it was a trick of the moonlight, but these shadows had shape, purpose. They weren't random. They followed me as I skated, staying just beneath the surface. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up, my pulse racing. I tried to tell myself it was fish, just fish, trapped under the ice. But I knew that didn't make sense. Not in this cold. Not in a lake this deep. The whispers came back, louder this time, echoing all around me. It felt like they were coming from beneath the ice, rising up through the cracks. I skated faster, desperate to get to the shore, but the shadows kept pace, weaving and swirling beneath me. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the first crack. The sound was like a gunshot, sharp and sudden, splitting the night. I froze, staring down at the ice. A thin line snaked out from under my skates, spreading in all directions. My chest tightened as I realized I was standing on thin ice, literally. I tried to move slowly, to edge my way toward the shore, but the ice groaned under my weight, and the cracks multiplied. That's when I saw it. Something moved just beneath the surface, right under my feet. It was large, much bigger than any fish or animal I'd ever seen. Its shape was distorted, rippling in the frozen water, but I could feel it watching me. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, staring down at the thing that shouldn't have been there. The ice gave way beneath me, and for a split second, I thought I was going under. But somehow, I managed to lunge forward, throwing myself onto solid ground just as the ice collapsed behind me. I lay there in the snow, gasping for breath, too terrified to look back. The whispers were gone. The shadows were gone. It was just me and the stillness of the night. When I finally had the courage to look, the ice was intact. Perfect. No cracks, no holes, no sign that it had ever broken. I stood there, staring at the lake, my mind racing. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was it just the cold, the dark, the isolation playing tricks on me? I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my skates and ran, not stopping until I was back home, locked in the safety of my room. Later, I found out about the lake's history. They said it was cursed, that every winter it claimed a life. The whispers, they said, were from those who had drowned long ago, calling out to anyone foolish enough to step onto the ice. I haven't been back since, and I never will. But sometimes on cold, quiet nights, I can still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, calling me back to the frozen lake. Snowmen aren't supposed to move, but what if one did? That's what happened to me and my family one winter. And even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there waiting. It started innocently enough. A heavy snowfall blanketed our neighborhood just after Christmas, leaving the streets quiet and white. My little brother, Danny, had been begging to build a snowman for days, and that morning, the conditions were perfect. The whole family got involved: Mom, Dad, me, and Danny. We spent hours rolling the snow into giant balls, stacking them one on top of the other until we had a classic three-tiered snowman right in the middle of our front yard. Dad added a scarf, Mom gave it a carrot nose, and Danny insisted on using these creepy old coal eyes he'd found in the garage. "He looks perfect," Danny said, grinning ear to ear. I remember feeling proud of it too. It was just a snowman, but it was ours. Little did we know, it wasn't going to stay just a snowman for long. That first night, I woke up to a strange feeling. You know that sensation you get when someone's watching you? I brushed it off as paranoia, but as I got out of bed to grab some water, I glanced out my bedroom window. The snowman was still there, standing exactly where we'd left it. But something about it looked off. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, so I went back to bed. If only I'd trusted my gut. The next morning, Danny ran downstairs to check on the snowman. "It's weird," he said when he came back in. "I think it moved." I laughed and told him he was imagining things. Snowmen don't move. But when I went outside later to grab the mail, I noticed it too. The snowman was closer to the house. Not by much, maybe a foot or two, but enough to make me pause. "It's just the snow settling," Dad said when I brought it up. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. Over the next few nights, things got worse. Danny started having nightmares, waking up screaming about a tall figure standing outside his window. "It's the snowman," he cried one night, his face pale and sweaty. "It's watching me." I told him it was just a bad dream, but deep down, I was scared too. Because every morning, the snowman was closer to the house. By the fourth night, it was practically on our front porch. Its coal eyes seemed to stare right into the house, and its branch-like arms had shifted, reaching out toward the windows. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed up, watching from my bedroom window, determined to catch whatever prankster was moving it. But no one ever came. The snowman just was. Always there. Always closer. The final straw came the next morning. When we woke up, the snowman was pressed against the living room window, its face tilted as if it were looking in. Its branch arms had grown longer somehow, their spindly fingers scraping against the glass. Danny screamed when he saw it, and Mom went pale. Even Dad, who had brushed everything off as coincidence, looked shaken. "We're getting rid of it," Dad said, grabbing a shovel. We all went outside, and together we destroyed it. We tore it apart piece by piece until there was nothing left but a pile of snow and some scattered coal. That night, for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The house was calm, the air was lighter, and Danny slept peacefully. But it didn't last. The next snowfall came a week later, and when we woke up that morning, the snowman was back. Same carrot nose, same scarf, same coal eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. But this time we hadn't built it. And this time, it wasn't in the yard. It was on the porch, leaning against the front door. We moved soon after that. Dad never talked about it, and Mom refused to acknowledge it ever happened. But I'll never forget the day we left. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The snowman was standing in the yard, watching us go. Years later, I heard that the new owners of the house saw it too. They called it a prank, just like we had at first. But when I drive by that house in the winter, I always notice one thing. No matter how much snow falls, there's never a snowman in the yard. Only a strange, empty patch of snow that looks like it's waiting.